So, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Talking Sales. I'm Greg Accardo, the director of the LSU Professional Sales Institute. Today, I have two really special and great guests. I have Robin Treasure and Braedi Delong. They're both uh, gap selling consultants. Okay, so they're going to hopefully introduce me, and everyone else to some really great information for all of us who are trying to relearn sales through a new lens, maybe a new methodology. And I've read the book of Gap Selling. I think like a lot of other people. So I've got a lot of questions now. I want to go deeper. So hopefully you guys can maybe plug in some answers for us. But if you would like, I'd like to have both of you maybe just introduce yourselves briefly.
Yeah. Brady, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, I'll kick us off. So I'm Braedi Delong, and my official title is the Chief Operating Officer of Sales Growth Company. Really many hats, though. You could probably also call me the Chief Learning Officer as well. So really taking up the charge on the learning and curriculum design for training, and kind of a partner and founder in the business. So I found Keenan on LinkedIn in 2017, and I was like, I like what you're doing. I want to take that and operationalize it, scale it, and convert it into a full-fledged methodology and training. So, and then gap selling was born.
Good.
Exactly. Yes.
Robin?
Yeah. And so I'm a certified gap selling trainer. I have a background in B2B sales as an individual contributor, later as a mentor to other colleagues in my company, as an official mentor. And then I went on to write and publish a book of my own entitled Heart Powered Sales, really focusing on the EQ aspect of sales. And then from there, I discovered gap selling. And for me, it was like all the lights came on. This was indeed the framework that I had been searching for, that was truly rooted in focusing on how to help buyers in a true and meaningful way. And so, because of that, I became certified as a gap selling trainer. And so, today, what I do is I lead trainings, trainings for teams, taking them through the core gap selling curriculum, and then reinforcing that with coaching and other things so that we can really help sellers not just learn what the methodology is about in concept, but really how to execute on it so that they can get better sales outcomes for themselves. So that's what I do.
So I probably should throw out a shout out to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Howard Dover at UT Dallas. So Howard introduced me to gap selling. So I came across the book because of him, because we trade reading lists. I do have an extensive reading list that I try to dive into over summers when I'm not teaching, just so that I can get more informed, more trained about how I can better educate my students. So big shout out to Howard Dover. He's part of the catalyst for all this happening. So, well, let's start off by just going right into it. So, could you start off by just explaining what gap selling is and how it differs from traditional sales methodologies?
Brady.
Robin's like, Brady. Um, so the core premise of gap selling is based off of business problems. And for most of the selling methodologies and trainings and environment, we've all been taught to sell on pain. But pain is really a symptom to a problem. Pain is often personal to the actual individual and not the organization. And as we've really moved into the information era with the development of the internet and information being so accessible, the salesperson is no longer like the keeper of the unique information. We have access. And so how that's manifested in what buyers and how buyers engage is they don't really utilize their salesperson in the same capacity. So they don't utilize the salesperson for testimonials and case stories as much as they do the intranet and third-party reviews. They don't need you to explain as much about the product up front because they have your website as a source. So the position of the salesperson is shifting. And the other part that's shifting with this pain problem conundrum is the quantity of stakeholders involved in a sale. So when we start to measure pain on an individual basis, the pain experience from one stakeholder to the other, it varies based off of the person and how much that environment is really impacting them. So problem is on an organizational level. It's the business problem, the business case that aligns the stakeholders. And I believe actually the 2023 research just got released that we now are at an average of 9 stakeholders per opportunity. So the pain funnel that we've all been taught since the 1960s, it's known by buyers. It's how almost every salesperson sells today. It does not help you differentiate, and it does not help you manage 9 stakeholders. Gap selling goes with the business acumen to say, hey, we need to go in, we need to lean in on business acumen. We need to define the business problem and make a case for organizational change. Mm-hmm. So that the stakeholders are aligned in the same problem-solving journey. And that's the biggest difference is gap selling is meeting buyers where they are today, not where they were in the 60s and 70s and 80s when Sandler and Spin were all developed, because buyers changed. We've changed.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Robin, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just also add that even as there has become more of an awareness that we need to focus on problems, on the buyer's problems and not product, there still persists a huge confusion over what actually defines a problem. And so there's a huge tendency to think that we are talking about the problems that matter to the buyer, but that's limited to the technical problem realm. And technical problems do not hold the intrinsic motivation to change. So Braedi's reference to, how do we get multiple stakeholders aligned on something that concerns the entire organization, that is the business problem that we need to get to. The business problem and the impacts of that problem are what hold that intrinsic motivation to change. And all of that refers to change management psychology, right? So what is it that's going to motivate change? Because change is difficult for any organization. So we all know from our personal worlds that we can tolerate a certain technical problem for ages. And the only reason why we'll actually take action and maybe risk making a bad decision is when that current state problem, technical problem, creates a business environment, so to speak, that will then become intolerable. And then we are motivated to change. So really differentiating between business problem and technical problem, which that sounds very simple. It's actually more difficult than it sounds in reality. So that's what we help teams to do.
Mm-hmm. So could you share a little about what was the inspiration behind the book, Gap Selling, and the whole concept?
Well, so it's kind of a two-up, right? Keenan had already started talking about on LinkedIn and his content and his tools around that sellers are really missing the foundation of why buyers buy. And so he had already started doing problem identification charts on a consulting basis because we started as a consulting firm and seeing the trends in the market through that consulting. I came in from a different perspective for me personally, where I was working with a Fortune 500 company and was entirely in charge of fixing the sales team who were not making their quota, who were discounting heavily, writing negative profit contracts. And I just started digging through and investigating. I'm like, why? What is happening? What is going on here to create this environment of extreme discounting and just losing deals? And I had this light bulb moment, and I'll never forget, like, there was a salesperson named Eddie, and Eddie had a deal. We were doing a deal review, and it struck me where I was like, they have no idea why buyers buy. This is it. They just don't understand the buyer's motivation to buy the product. Mm-hmm. And so I stopped everything, put together buyer training, and I was like, we're not going to learn selling skills. We're not going to learn tips and tricks. We are going to deeply learn our customer base. And we went from 80% of quota to 900% of quota attainment the next quarter because they suddenly started winning their pipeline. Like that was it. It just like all of a sudden they knew the questions to ask. They knew what to get to the bottom of and started winning the pipeline that they had today. And that's really what shook me. That's where I was like, oh my gosh, I've spent a career in operations and I've never seen sales training work. This worked. And so Keen and I kind of merged forces and merged backgrounds to be like, how do we really package this into a holistic methodology? So he saw it on the consulting side, I saw it on the operational side, and it really came down to one core principle: we don't understand our buyers.
Yeah, totally agree, 100%. So let's go ahead and walk through the mechanics. So, what are the typical stages of the gap selling process from meeting the contact to closing a deal?
So for the sales stages, we don't 100% dictate to you all the stages as one standard, because different businesses will have different process needs, right? Particularly in how complex your buying process is. So we don't dictate the 100% of the process. What we do dictate is the first thing is qualification criteria. Understanding what is a qualified opportunity as opposed to what is a lead. That's an important step in gap selling. Most people don't know how to qualify an opportunity. I would say probably the majority of the market, their qualification criteria is they have a pulse and they're willing to talk to me. That's most of the qualification. Some people have a formal qualification like utilizing BANT, but really when you talk to the front line, even if there is a formal qualification they're supposed to follow, they rarely do. So really nailing down what is the qualification of an opportunity, and making sure it's consistent. The second thing is the problem being identified and the problem being defined. Those are two required stages in the sales cycle. You must identify the problem and you must define the problem before you can move your deal forward. Now, once you're moving the deal forward and you're starting to move into buying process stages, those should be based off of your buyers. So there's people that have RFPs as a standard. That's going to be a stage, but that's not going to stage for everybody. So those have variants. And then the next piece that we require is called the forecast qualification. This is an interesting piece. Most people throw out qualification as a singular thing, but there's really two stages to qualify. You need to qualify lead to opportunity, that this is a qualified opportunity, but then there's a different set of criteria to qualify for the forecast. So there's forecast qualification. That is actually quite a complex field and mapping and scoring and weighting of information, but really making sure that we have tight forecast qualification. Most people don't qualify a forecast. They actually just forecast off of historicals, and that can be quite misleading. So we found most sales organizations have like a 50% forecast accuracy, which is literally, Greg, is as good as a coin toss. If you really think about it, you might as well flip a coin and call it. So forecast qualifications. So there's pieces that are required and there's pieces that have vertical or industry variation.
Okay. Robin, you want to add anything to that? That was pretty in-depth, though.
Yeah, and exactly. So the one thing that I would add is that it's really interesting because that one initial piece of qualification criteria, I've had the opportunity to ask dozens of sales leaders, what is it that makes an opportunity qualified for your pipeline today? And like Braedi said, it kind of comes down to a pulse, right? Do they have a pulse? Do they, are they living? But that's a little tongue in cheek. But beyond that, it usually comes down to something like, do they have a technical need? Has the buyer said that they need our software? Has the buyer said that they are doing things manually today? And that does not make a qualified opportunity. What makes a qualified opportunity is, do they have a business problem that if we address the technical problem, will make that business problem go away? And can we define, using specific metrics, what is the size of that business problem today? That's what makes an opportunity qualified. But also, so that's, do they have the problem? But then also, do they agree they have the problem? They may not see it the way we do. So there needs to be agreement with your buyer. Do they want to fix the problem? Or is there something else in the organization that takes bigger priority? And will they go on a journey with you to fix that problem? To
So,
explore.
so how does gap selling prioritize understanding a customer's needs over, say, traditional focus on product features and benefits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so features and benefits are very easy to revert to, especially for frontline sellers. When they're not sure of what to ask the buyer about and what they are looking for, it's very easy to fall into that comfort zone of talking about the features and benefits and hoping that it catches the attention of the buyer. Even if they try to put the product to the side, because what we preach is forget about your product. Nobody cares about your product. They care about your problems, right? So even doing that, putting the product to the side, sometimes a seller will then revert to a technical needs discovery. What are you doing today? That's a manual process. That's inefficient. Is that creating frustration in your team? But that all stays limited to that technical realm. So being able to zoom out, I like to describe it as zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, is how we get away from that needs assessment, that technical needs assessment, which of course is important, right? But not at the beginning stages. At the beginning stages, it's more like, why does any of this matter in the first place, right? If you've got inefficient processes, but you are somehow getting phenomenal results in the business, why change? Seems to be working, right? So and even if we think, great, I mean, even if the buyer says, yeah, well, it's less efficient than we need to, that buyer will eventually ghost.
Can you share a success story where someone has implemented Gap, or you've helped them install Gap in their sales process where it resulted in success?
Yeah, I mean, we see it a lot where we work with a team, we lead the training. The training is, it's quite intense, and there is some stumbling that happens in the first couple of weeks afterwards. But consistently, what we hear is that when the methodology is being implemented and executed, and it doesn't have to be to perfection, but just focusing on business, finding those business problems, we see that teams pretty consistently get a 10 to 30% lift in their win rates.
Mm-hmm.
And their sales cycles, the length of those sales cycles can be shortened dramatically. Mm-hmm. So that's typical of what we hear. Braedi may want to share an anecdote aside from what she shared with the company where you first applied this, right? Where you first started, you went from 80% quota attainment to 900% quota attainment. I mean, this is what we hear when it's applied and executed.
Yeah, so the 10 to 30% lift in win rates, that's really the kind of like early results. So it's really fascinating. In training, we do active deal reviews, and there's deal reviews that happen even on day one of training. We've had reps take those deal reviews, evaluate their data deficits that they learned in training just from day one, reach out to their customers, ask those few handful of questions that were in their blind spots, and actually start to bring opportunities that were completely gone dark back into conversation. We've even had some reps literally close win contracts on their breaks during training because they finally got a chance to have a coach walk them through what they were missing. And once they knew what they were missing, they were like, oh my gosh, I only need to ask 5 more questions. On an organizational level, there's a learning curve. So we have a company that just released their update. We trained them, I want to say we started training them 6 months ago and have worked on a coaching kind of cadence with really continuing to bring gap selling into the organization moving into more sophisticated concepts, their win rate has improved by like 60% now.
Wow.
So there's time. It takes time. Like when we first train an organization, we call it getting down the greens, right? But then we're going to coach you to get to the blues, and we're going to coach you to get to the blacks. But that takes practice. Takes practice because you're really playing a new sport in gap selling. Like, yes, there's overlap, but you're really playing a completely different sport of sales at this point. So there's time it takes to practice. It's incredible, though, how quickly once you just show people with the problem identification chart, like this is what you need to understand, they finally have like a map to navigate. Like they didn't have a map before.
Yeah.
So they were just navigating blind, I think
And
of
the
it.
chart is really simple too.
It's a simple concept. It's a simple chart. It is a beast to create. It takes a lot of research and debate, a heavy debate to finally get it. But once you have your map, kind of to your last question about feature-driven sales, I like to think of this as like you're driving blind when you're feature-based or product-based. You're just hoping that the feature you talk about hits the bullseye, right? Hits the correct topic, because you don't have a navigation map, and you give somebody a pick. It's like, okay, well, now you're driving. You're not necessarily driving with Google Maps yet, but you're definitely driving with an actual map. And it's incredible to see how fundamentally game-changing that is for salespeople to have that guide.
Yeah, to know where they're headed, where they need to take the conversation, what they need to understand or discover. I love to emphasize the word of discovery is about uncover what's hidden there, right? Turn over those puzzle pieces. And that's how you get to that. But how could you do it if you don't know where you're headed and what you're looking for?
So how does gap selling adapt to different industries or markets? And are there any sectors where it's particularly effective?
Mm-hmm. Well, we tend to work with a lot of technology companies, a lot of SaaS companies, but it's very adaptable. So it can apply to many different industries. It just happens to be that's where we tend to have a lot of clients. And the key piece, though, is that with every client that we work with every team we work with, we completely customize it to their selling environment. And so when we lead a training, it's only about half lecture and the other half is very activity based, exercise based, because this is how people learn. And one of the activities that we do is role play. And that role play, we like to call it real play, because we do a lot of study and preparation to create an entire role play scenario with dozens of different data points that's created very realistically, that of course the sellers don't know anything about. And so then we're playing that role and they need to find those pieces of information so that we're not making up answers on the spot. It's all predefined. This is how we customize it to your selling environment, to your ICP, because I should have mentioned it's completely based on each company's ICP. And so that's how we can adapt to different industries as well.
Well, in academia, we call that experiential learning.
Absolutely.
So let's go ahead and pretend someone is sold that, hey, I want to start gap selling, and they want to dive in and start adopting the methodology. What are some of the common challenges that these sales teams could face? Okay, and how do they overcome these?
Some of them are.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Braedi.
Sorry, I was like, I want to make sure I'm understanding this. The challenge they would face in implementing
typical challenges. Just typical challenges that you see once people are on board. What are some typical challenges that you notice common, and how do they simply just overcome those?
Yeah, so
changing processes, right? It's a change of culture, a process, whatever you want to call it.
Some of it is just about what is not familiar is not comfortable. And this will, in some ways, prompt sellers to take a step backwards into what is comfortable, i.e. what they already know, right? So it's easy to have the knee-jerk reaction or reflex to ask questions that they've always typically asked in discovery and other things. So
Mm-hmm.
part of it, that's why reinforcement is so important after training, so that they don't revert to those habits. Just in terms of the discomfort provokes a feeling, and feelings drive behaviors. So when a seller feels uncomfortable with a new situation, again, they're going to be tempted to revert to comfort. But the reward in branching out and embracing something new is seeing different results. And so once they start seeing those different results, trying something new, asking a question that may feel slightly uncomfortable, especially when talking about business problems, it's, they may not feel confident in their business acumen, but this is why we prepare them with the problem identification chart, which we refer to as their business acumen guide. Braedi just came up with this wonderful way of describing it recently. This is how we empower them to override that discomfort and embrace something new and have the confidence in their building their business acumen to be able to get this information and ask these questions. So these are some of the challenges I've seen in the teams. Braedi may want to add more to it too.
Well, every team is going to have unique challenges based off of, well, what were the behaviors that are kind of most important to course correct. So they're all going to have their own unique set, right? Which I'm sure you've observed. Every class has their style, their vibe. I was actually just on a call earlier with a CRO who they just finished their training series, and then on Monday they're going into continued learning with more role play. And he shared with me that the people that were more resistant, who, you're more seasoned, right? The longer you've been in sales, the more things you've been trained that you might now need to correct, kind of relearning and letting go of old habits can be challenging. And he said that one of the people who was really resistant to gap selling, he just started his discovery calls being really transparent with his buyers, where he's like, hey, we're trying a new approach to sales. This is the approach. And in doing this approach, this is the agenda for today. This is what I'm going to try to uncover and learn so that I can help you. And since it's new to me, I might stumble and fall from time to time because I'm learning this myself. But this is what we're going to attempt to do. And after he did that with a handful of his buyers, he came back and he was like, I did not anticipate how positively buyers responded to a new agenda. And he was shook, because he was resistant. He was like, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't feel like buyers are going to share like this. And then as he just told them what his goal was, to learn and to understand and to help and to find it, buyers were so positive and showed such a intense relief that this was going to be a productive conversation and that this is going to be a trusted advisor and this is going to have somebody who has their best interest at heart, that the conversation actually became considerably easier. But getting them there is hard.
Yeah, exactly. But that just speaks to the power of transparency and honesty and vulnerability, that that salesperson being willing to say, like, hey, this is a little uncomfortable, setting expectations that, hey, we might stumble a little bit. It actually goes so far in creating those authentic conversations.
Yeah, it sounds like using a little empathy too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
empathy is a big part
powerful.
of gap selling.
So,
Yes.
well, I'm really curious as a sales coach. Let's move on to the next big topic. So, how does the gap selling approach handle objection handling?
Part of what gap selling does is remind people that if you're hearing objections from your buyer, it's a sign that you've actually gotten ahead of your buyer. So their objections are a signal that they're not seeing eye to eye, that there's no longer agreement on the size of the problem. So it's often a signal that we need to slow down with our buyers and What we mean by that is we actually teach that there are two sales within every sale. The first is, should the buyer change at all? Right? Let's forget about us and our solution. Should the buyer even make a change? And again, it's not about the size of the technical problem, it's how is it impacting the business? So this is where we need to start. If then it is determined that the current state, the way things are, if no change is made, is going to be intolerable and we can't live with the results or the consequences, okay, now there's agreement that we need to change. So that's sale number one. Then sale number two is, should they change to us as the sellers with our solution, or should they choose someone else? That's sale number two. But what we tend to do is we skip number one. We assume as sellers that they are ready to change, and we jump ahead. And that's when the buyer says, whoa, 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 hold up here. I'm not sure I see the value or the why or why I should do this. And the way they articulate that is with a price objection or an objection about timing. But often those are a veiled response to a deeper objection, which is, why should I even do this in the first place? So when we stay on the same page and keep pace with the buyer and really uncover why they should make a change at all, this is how we can start to preempt some of those objections. And price, of course, being the most common one. Once you've understood the size of the problem, and if the size of the business problem is in the multi-millions and your solution is $10,000 or $20,000, there's a clear reason, there's a clear, compelling business case for why you should make that investment, right? But in a vacuum, without that information, without being able to anchor it to the size of the business problem, it just sounds like a lot of money without any why behind it. So this is how we can start to preempt those objections before they even come up.
And I'll add a little bit to that as well, because like there's a variety of objections out there. Decision criteria and crafting decision criteria is part of objection handling. Sometimes we all get a little anchored in like wanting things or perceived need that are a bit misguided or unfounded. I usually teach the concept from just a place of like buying a house. If you've ever bought a house or worked with a first-time buyer around their want and need list, it's like half the things they write down have no bearing on their life. It's like, oh, I would love to have this, and I would love to have this, and this would be super cool, and I've heard about this, and they get really kind of engulfed in this sea of bells and whistles sometimes that you have to like actively manage, because most buyers don't know how to evaluate their options. And so what they end up doing is they get to this place where all their options, especially in a competitive sale, it's like everybody kind of looks the same. So the only discernible difference between option A, B, and C is the price. And you end up in price wars because they can't differentiate their options in any other capacity. So being able to learn, okay, this is the business case, this is the root cause, these are the critical features that are required to fix that root cause, and helping them learn how to evaluate what's going to solve their problem environment. Most buyers really struggle on doing this themselves. They really struggle with evaluation criteria. And decision criteria has been in the sales community for a long time. But what we miss, and gap selling starts to really craft, is there's a difference between early decision criteria and late decision criteria. Early decision criteria that we've been taught, I think of that as, you know, with the house buying situation, that's okay, I need 3 bedrooms and I need 2 bathrooms and I'd like a yard, you know, and it's like, it's that early list. But there's hundreds of houses that are going to meet that list. And they're going to say no to hundreds of houses that meet that list. So you have to really say, okay, well, hold the phone, right? There's more to the evaluation process to be able to pare down 100 options to 1. And that's where salespeople really start to miss, and they start to get lost in feature requests, and then they start to pester engineering where like, we need to build this or this customer won't come with us. Right? So we have to really start to understand that the full problem environment so that we can really get a mutual action plan created that's going to appropriately fix it. And by us knowing, and again, like you got to know, you got to really know your stuff to do this. Mm-hmm. But you got to be able to prove that you are the best positioned vendor product that's going to address their problem environment better than anybody else. Mm-hmm. And that starts to take those objections off the table.
So would it also be correct to assume that if you can identify the gap, okay, and when an objection comes up, you reiterate that the gap is our focus. Here's the cost of the solution. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Point out the differences. Obviously the cost is a lot less than what it's going to do to close the gap. Mm-hmm. Would that be more where you'd focus more, turn the conversation back toward the gap versus really talk about gap selling, right? You find the gap, you find where areas where you can close the gap. Mm-hmm. Obviously, your solution should be that, but you would go back to that when you're trying to address objections.
We do go back to the gap, and we really lean in on the cost of change because yes, buyers might give you a price objection on like more than anything else. They're going to vocalize a price objection. But there's a lot of things that are to the change environment. If you have an invasive product that you have a high change, right? You have a huge learning curve. You have a difficult implementation. Like think of like an ERP or changing your entire financial software. Things that have high change in the environment. You have to have a really significant gap for people to be willing to put in the time, effort, and energy to implement a high change tool. Like there's so much, you have to really know this is my gap and this is my cost of change, full cost, effort, energy, resources. Resources are expensive, right? And they're way more expensive than paying your invoice, right? So resources and really looking and taking a good, honest look yourself and your buyer. Is this worth it? And that's the gap.
Mm-hmm. So beyond just increases in sales, what are some other metrics or indicators that you look for to assess whether gap selling is creating that desired impact on a sales organization?
Mm-hmm. So go ahead, Braedi, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a few things we look at when we're in our diagnostic phase. One is we want to look at all of the selling problems because there's a variety of ways sales can be broken. We also want to look at, which is a very extra layer, could it be something else? So a great example is if your product isn't that good and it doesn't have a good market position and you are not able to compete with your competition, right? Your competition is a lower price and higher quality than you. Right? That can look a lot like a selling problem, but it actually is a product problem. You have to fix the product. I can't train salespeople to sell a poor product, right? That's always going to be kind of a barrier. So we have to assess the full sales problems. We have to get to the specific root causes. There's probably 60, 70 different root causes we have to really hash out to know exactly what is broken. And we have to be able to prioritize those. And so our diagnostic process is very robust. We're obviously diagnosing a really huge part of businesses, so it has to be robust. But we have to make sure it's a sales skills problem because it can look like other things, right? So we call it like no sales malpractice. It's kind of like your doctor. They have a good hypothesis around what's probably wrong with you based off of your symptoms, but they still perform the MRI. They validate it and go through a validation protocol. So we're looking at sales problems, but we go through a detailed validation protocol so we don't commit sales malpractice.
So how do you see the role of gap selling evolving with the future trends in sales and technology and AI?
Mm-hmm.
So tools are very complementary to gap selling, but they're not going to ever overcome knowing your buyers. Right? So using different tools and embedding different tools and having those efficiencies, like that's great. But the core of gap selling evolving is we still have to make sure that buyers are met where buyers need to be. So I would really say it's more about adapting to buyer change, because look at how differently we buy today. Like look at just our lifetimes. Like none of us on this call are that old.
It's the Amazon effect.
Like
Mm-hmm.
the way we bought 20 years ago is not how we buy today.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just not. And so we have to really make sure that like our business acumen and our understanding of our buyers, that's going to keep evolving.
Mm-hmm.
And gap selling is built to be pliable, to continue to evolve with our customers.
Right.
And also, the AI tools that are out there are wonderful tools that can be well utilized to support our work as sellers. But we still have to have the critical thinking skills. We still have to provide the right prompts in order to get the right answers from AI, right? We still have to be able to put all the pieces together and create that analysis of what's going to suit the buyer. And yes, meet the buyer where they're at, as Braedi said, especially when you can have your ICP and your buyer persona well understood. But then within each individual opportunity, it's a unique circumstance. So you have to be able to get in at the granular level and understand their world.
Yeah. Well, why don't we move into some advice, and then we'll transition to some closing thoughts, and we'll let you guys cap this off. So let's just start off with the simple question: what advice would you give to sales leaders and teams that are considering that, hey, maybe we need to take a look at integrating gap selling?
Yeah. So a couple pieces. Whatever methodology you are considering, you have to remember that the teaching part is just one part. It has to be reinforced. And that's not just through reinforcement from the training organization, but then from leadership within the sales organization going forward. So that must be reinforced through deal reviews, through pipeline reviews, and then also it must be operationalized through the CRM must be structured in a way that it reinforces the methodology. So in the case of gap selling, there must be the right fields in the CRM so that they can capture the right data in terms of current state and future state, the 5 pieces of each, right? So that's how you operationalize it and then reinforce it and make sure that that execution happens from sales leadership to frontline managers all the way down to individual sellers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one piece of it there. Mm-hmm.
I think I'll take a different, since you did such a beautiful job on leadership, I'll do this frontline sellers. There's one thing, if you're a frontline seller, that you want to improve in your selling to address, like if I had to pick one of all the things, listening skills. I know it's a soft skill. I know it's hard to measure. I know it's hard to find, but most salespeople accidentally hold an interrogation instead of a conversation because they don't listen and respond to their buyer. And it's not from an ill will or an ill intention. It's we're so hung up in our own agenda and so hung up on our perfect next question to ask that we stop listening and we kind of break our human. It's really an interesting phenomenon that sales objective breaks our ability to hold a human conversation. And this is like I think the number one behavior that if I could like squash in the sales community, I would, because nothing that you do and no methodology and no amount of discovery, none of it matters if you don't hear the answer and respond. And so I would say my number one tip to the sales community, if you really want to improve, really hone your listening skills. And I'm talking deep listening. And this does evolve EQ and empathy and being able to identify like, ooh, they're nervous, they're hesitant, they didn't like that, they got spicy, right? Their face says spicy, they're about to bite my hand, right? But it's deep listening is probably one of the most missing skills I see in the sales community.
I tell my students a lot. I say that if you ask the right questions and if you listen, people will tell you why they will buy your product.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to learn how to listen with the intent. It's not the intent just to answer the question. You need to listen with the intent to follow up.
Yes.
And to understand.
Yes.
And so with college students, that's hard sometimes because you're dealing with a different mindset around attention span. But hopefully by the time they graduate, they remember that conversation I had with them that you have to listen.
Mm-hmm.
If you become a great listener, you become a great salesperson. That's
100%.
kind of what I'm packaging for them to understand.
100%.
So, okay, guys, closing thoughts. So we covered a lot. We've almost 45 minutes. So give us your closing thoughts, advice for sales professionals today. What do you want to leave our audience with? And I'll turn it over to both of you. Go.
Mm-hmm. I would say this is going to be hard, but forget about your product for a moment. Just forget about your product for a moment. Put yourself in your buyer's shoes. See the world through their eyes. Think about the problems that they're trying to solve. Think about their KPIs. How, by what measures is their success measured? And from there, you can start to understand what's really going to motivate them, what's important to them. And then from there, you can go into your root cause diagnosis, understand what technical problems need to be fixed, and can your solution fix it? So it's really just about, again, we did use that word empathy. It's really about exercising empathy, putting yourself in your buyer's shoes. This will transform the relationship that you have with your buyers.
Great. Braedi?
Probably, this similar notion is what Robin is saying is learn your buyer's world. Like if you who you sell to, like whether that's the vertical or the job title, like learn your buyer's world. I'm often really surprised at salespeople absorb more learning content than I think any other profession does. I mean, the quantity of books they read and podcasts and newsletters. I mean, it's incredible on sales skills. But it's also incredible on how little that efforts actually end up in the buyer's world. And as we talk to salespeople and we start asking them questions around who they sell to, and it's a lot of unknowns. It's like, well, no, I don't actually know. It's like, so if you sell into HR, you should know a lot about HR. You should know the function of HR. You should know how HR is measured. You should understand what are their unique KPIs? What is their day to day? Like, what is their core responsibility? What are they accountable for? And really starting to learn your buyers. And it's incredible to me because that's such a deficit in the community. And I know it is because we talk to people all the time. And when we talk to them, one of our questions in Discovery 1 is, what problems do you believe you solve? And I have yet to receive a single person give me a competent answer.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, guys, this has been a great conversation. I want to thank you both for the contribution that you're making to not only the sales profession, but also to the LSU Professional Sales Institute, our College of Business, our students who are probably all going to watch this. And I'll close out, but just recommending that the gap selling book is impactful. I would recommend if you're in sales, you're really shortchanging yourself by not reading that book. It changed me. I've been teaching sales now for 10 years, and it was a fresh new perspective. I think it's something maybe I was waiting for.
Yes.
and was happy to have it.
Yes.
That's exciting.
Yep.
I always love that. Like, that's what we're here. We're here to serve the sales community. So
Right.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Listen, thank you again, and keep up the great work, and hopefully we can do this again another day.
Likewise.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.